What would you do if your peaceful morning coffee turned into a nightmare discovery? Your lawn drenched, your water bill sky high, and your hose mysteriously warm. For Mike, it wasn't just a glitch. It was his neighbor Karen brazenly stealing his water, claiming it as community property. When confronting her didn't work, Mike plotted the ultimate revenge. One involving a sewage tank, a hidden camera, and a viral neighborhood scandal. Don't miss this epic tale of justice served with a splash. Literally, one quiet Sunday morning, Mike stepped out onto his porch with a hot cup of coffee, savoring the peaceful start to his day. As he took a sip, something caught his eye. His lawn looked unusually wet, like it had just endured a torrential downpour. Puddles shimmered in the sunlight, and the grass squished under his feet as he walked across it. Confused, he glanced up at the clear sky. No sign of rain. Mike squatted down and picked up his garden hose. It felt warm, like it had been used recently, even though he hadn't touched it in days. Mike wrinkled his brow, trying to make sense of it. Maybe the hose had a leak or the automatic sprinkler malfunction. But then reality struck him. He didn't even have an automatic sprinkler system. He only had the one hose coiled neatly next to the spigot. Scratching his head, he went inside to check his water bill, which had just arrived in the mail. His jaw dropped. The bill had tripled. It was as if he'd been filling a swimming pool for weeks straight. Feeling his blood pressure rise, Mike knew something was off. Determined to solve the mystery, he started observing his lawn from the living room window, like a detective on a stakeout. The next morning, the lawn was drenched again. Now thoroughly perplexed, Mike decided to casually chat with his neighbors and see if anyone else was experiencing the same odd phenomenon. Most of them just shrugged, except for old Mr. Davis, who mentioned something about that lady across the street always spraying her driveway. That lady, Karen. Karen had moved into the neighborhood just a few months ago, and since then, she'd made quite the impression. Always strutting around with her perfectly manicured nails and clipboard, Karen acted like she was the queen of the cul-de-sac. She wasn't technically the HOA president, but you would know it from the way she bossed people around. She'd filed complaints about paint colors, fence heights, and even the shade of green on someone's shutters. Nothing seemed to escape her scrutiny. That evening, Mike parked his car a bit farther down the street, giving him a better vantage point to watch his yard. As he unloaded groceries from his trunk, he caught her in the act. There was Karen, decked out in her floral blouse and enormous sun hat, dragging his hose across the lawn like it was hers. She hooked it up to a portable pressure washer and started blasting her front porch. Mike stood frozen, stunned at the audacity. She looked up, saw him, and gave a cheerful wave. "Hope you don't mind," she shouted. "Just a quick rinse." Mike couldn't believe it. He gripped the car door, unsure whether to confront her right then or wait it out. Trying to compose himself, he put the groceries inside, then crossed the street to talk to her. Karen didn't even look guilty. When Mike pointed out that she was using his water without permission, she gave him a dismissive smile. "Community property, sweetie," Karen said with a haughty tone. "We're all supposed to share and be neighborly." Mike's hands clenched, but he forced a polite tone. "I'd appreciate it if you'd ask before using my hose next time." She just snorted. "You're being dramatic," Karen replied. "It's just water." As Mike walked away, he knew this wasn't over. That night, he emailed the HOA, explaining the situation and attaching photos of Karen using his hose. The next day, he got a response that made his eye twitch. "Please resolve minor neighbor disputes amicably without HOA intervention." Mike couldn't believe it. Not only was Karen stealing his water, but the HOA didn't care. Deciding he needed to take matters into his own hands, he bought a heavy-duty lock and secured it tightly to the hose spigot. Problem solved, or so he thought. The next morning, the lock was gone. Not opened, but gone. Cleanly cut, as if someone had taken bolt cutters to it. Anger bubbled up inside Mike like a boiling kettle. As he surveyed the evidence, he saw Karen, again, this time washing her massive SUV, humming to herself like she was starring in a car commercial. Mike took a deep breath and marched over, this time determined to make his point clear. "Karen," he shouted, forcing his voice to stay calm, "did you cut my lock?" She didn't even flinch. It was a safety hazard. Someone could have tripped. Besides, your water pressure is just too good to pass up. Mike was dumbfounded. Was this woman serious? Before he could respond, Karen flicked her hair and strutted back to her hose-thieving escapade. Frustrated and out of ideas, Mike decided it was time to document everything. He set up a small security camera aimed at the spigot, hiding it just well enough to avoid suspicion. That night, he reviewed the footage, and sure enough, there was Karen, sneaking across his lawn at dawn like some water bandit. The camera caught her dragging the hose, filling up a kiddie pool, watering her plants, and washing her dog. It was almost comical how entitled she looked. Mike decided to take it one step further. He uploaded the video to the neighborhood forum with a simple caption, "Guess who's paying my water bill?" The reaction was explosive. Comments flooded in, ranging from anger at Karen's audacity to suggestions on how to lock down the hose better. Someone even joked about electrifying the spigot. But the best part? Karen saw it. She stormed over to Mike's house the next day, pounding on his door. "How dare you post that video?" she screeched. "That's invasion of privacy." "You were on my property," Mike replied, crossing his arms. "And that makes it theft." Her face turned beet red. "You're going to regret this," she snapped. "Do something about it. I dare you." And that was the moment Mike's brain shifted gears. The dare lit a fire in him. No more Mr. Nice Guy. She wanted a fight? Fine. He'd give her one. That night, an idea took root, one so devious it made him smirk. If Karen wanted water, she was going to get it. A lot of it. Just not the kind she expected. He knew about the construction site a few blocks down, where they'd recently set up a massive temporary sewage tank. All he needed was a little ingenuity and some elbow grease to make his plan come to life. The next day, Mike struck up a friendly conversation with one of the workers at the site. After a bit of chatting and a discreet tip, he had permission to use the tank for just one night. He rigged the hose with an underground line, connected to the tank via a cleverly concealed valve. By the time he finished, his lawn looked untouched, and the hose appeared as normal as ever. Now all that was left was to wait and let Karen take the bait. The trap was set, and Mike knew that Karma was about to make a very messy visit to her front porch. The next morning, Mike barely slept. His anticipation simmered beneath a calm exterior as he casually peered through his blinds. Just as expected, Karen appeared, wearing her typical oversized sun hat and floral blouse, marching confidently across his lawn. This time, she didn't even hesitate. She picked up the hose, gave it a cursory glance to make sure the lock wasn't back, and dragged it across the street to her yard. Mike couldn't help but chuckle under his breath. The setup was flawless. He'd tested it twice the previous night to make sure nothing would malfunction. Karen hooked the hose up to her brand new rotating sprinkler, one of those fancy ones that made wide, graceful arcs, and turned the spigot with a triumphant flourish. There was a low gurgle at first, and Mike's heart pounded in his chest. Then the hose sputtered like it was choking, and finally, whoosh, a thick, putrid jet of brown, foul-smelling sewage erupted from the sprinkler, spraying across Karen's meticulously maintained lawn. The sprinkler spun in slow, graceful arcs, spraying her rose bushes, patio furniture, and pristine white wicker chair. Karen froze, eyes wide in shock, as the foul liquid drenched everything in its path. The stench was unimaginable, thick, sour, and utterly revolting. She shrieked in horror, trying to shield her face as the rotating sprinkler soaked her from head to toe. The sheer absurdity of it made Mike cover his mouth to suppress a laugh. To his delight, a few neighbors who had heard the commotion had come out to see what was going on. One elderly woman from 2 houses down dropped her gardening shears and stared in disbelief. Another neighbor holding a cup of coffee openly burst out laughing as Karen screamed, "Bloody murder!" Karen tried to turn the spigot off, but her slippery, sewage-soaked hands couldn't get a grip. In her panic, she tripped over the hose and landed face first in the muck, smearing her blouse and sun hat with the foul mixture. People were already recording with their phones, capturing the scene from different angles. Someone muttered, "Finally, Karma's got her," and another neighbor snapped a quick photo of Karen struggling to her feet, covered in sludge. The chaos continued as Karen, realizing she was being filmed, screamed at everyone to stop recording, but it was too late. Videos and photos were already spreading like wildfire through the neighborhood chat and social media. In a desperate attempt to reclaim some dignity, Karen stormed toward Mike's house, leaving a trail of sludge and sewage behind her. She banged furiously on his door, screaming about lawsuits and how he had poisoned her property. Mike opened the door just enough to poke his head out and, with the most composed smile he could muster, asked, "Something wrong with the water pressure today?" Karen lost it, her face twisted in fury. "You sabotaged me. I'll sue you for everything. You think this is funny?" "Actually, I think it's justice," Mike replied calmly. "And don't worry, I have plenty of footage to show exactly who's been stealing water for weeks." "You brought this on yourself," Karen sputtered, her hands trembling with rage. "I'll make sure you regret this. You'll pay for what you've done to me." Mike just shrugged. "I've got nothing to hide. You, on the other hand, everyone knows the truth now. Good luck convincing the HOA that you're the victim here." Just as he finished speaking, two HOA board members arrived, clearly having heard the commotion. They hesitated when they saw Karen's filthy state, but their faces grew stern when they spotted the sewage soaking into her yard. Mike handed them a USB drive with all the footage and documentation, including the HOA bylaw clearly stating that trespassing and using another homeowner's utilities without permission was a violation. Karen, still trembling, tried to plead her case. "He set me up. This was intentional. You need to find him, arrest him." The board members exchanged glances, one of them sighing deeply. "Karen, we've received multiple complaints about your behavior. This incident is just the latest in a long list. We will review the evidence, but from what we've seen and heard so far, it doesn't look good for you." "What about my reputation?" Karen shrieked. "He humiliated me in front of everyone." The other board member raised an eyebrow. "You mean after you cut his lock and repeatedly stole his water?" "We've got a lot to discuss at the next meeting, but I suggest you clean yourself up in the meantime." Karen stormed back to her house, muttering curses under her breath, while the board members remained to question Mike. After reviewing the evidence, they assured him that Karen would face disciplinary action. A few hours later, Mike got a notification on his phone. Someone had posted the footage on social media, and it was already gaining traction. His phone buzzed with messages from neighbors expressing their gratitude and disbelief at Karen's meltdown. Someone had even turned the video into a meme, captioned, "When you mess with the wrong garden hose." For the rest of the day, Mike couldn't wipe the grin off his face. The tension that had loomed over his quiet life for weeks finally evaporated, replaced by a sense of victory and satisfaction. He knew Karen wasn't done plotting yet. She was too stubborn to admit defeat. But for now, he let himself relish the moment. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mike glanced out the window and saw a few neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, still chuckling about Karen's disastrous sprinkler show. He joined them, swapping stories and sharing laughs, and for the first time in months, the neighborhood felt united. But deep down, Mike knew Karen was already concocting her next move. He didn't know what it would be or how bad it might get, but he knew one thing for sure. He'd be ready. The next morning, Mike felt the aftermath of his victory still buzzing through the neighborhood. People waved to him more frequently, gave him appreciative nods, and even congratulated him for standing up to Karen. It felt good, like justice had finally been served. But Mike knew better than to let his guard down. He had learned the hard way that Karen wasn't the type to back off quietly. He just didn't realize how far she was willing to go. That evening, while Mike was finishing his dinner, a loud, frantic banging echoed from his front door. He opened it cautiously, half expecting another confrontation with Karen, but instead it was Glenn, the soft-spoken neighbor from 2 houses down. Glenn looked frazzled, his hands shaking as he pointed toward the street. "You need to see this," Glenn whispered, his voice tense. "Karen's gone ballistic." Curiosity piqued, Mike followed him out to the sidewalk. A small crowd had gathered, murmuring and whispering as they watched Karen's front yard. To Mike's utter shock, Karen was out there, hose in hand, furiously scrubbing her driveway with a vengeance. But it wasn't just the frantic cleaning that caught his attention. It was the collection of signs she had set up along the perimeter of her property. Hand-painted in thick, bold letters, they read, "Beware of psychopath. Danger, deranged neighbor. Violent man lives here." Karen was deliberately spreading rumors that Mike was mentally unstable and dangerous, trying to paint herself as the victim of his attacks. Glenn put a hand on Mike's shoulder and shook his head in disbelief. "I heard her ranting to the board members earlier," Glenn said quietly. "She's telling everyone you're a menace and that you intentionally tried to poison her yard. She even claimed you threatened her life." Mike's stomach churned with anger. This wasn't just petty revenge anymore. Karen was actively trying to destroy his reputation. As more neighbors started to notice the spectacle, Karen put on her best sob story, talking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "He's trying to ruin me," she shouted dramatically. "All because I used a little water. Who does that? It's not right. I'm the real victim here." The crowd didn't seem convinced, but Mike could tell some were unsure. The more Karen wailed, the more sympathetic glances she garnered from a few residents who hadn't witnessed the sewage incident firsthand. Frustration burned in Mike's chest, and he knew he needed to do something, fast. That evening, Mike crafted a careful post on the neighborhood forum, laying out the entire story from start to finish, including all the video evidence and interactions with Karen. He included screenshots of his correspondence with the HOA and clearly laid out how Karen had vandalized his property, cut his hose lock, and continued to harass him despite being told to stop. Almost immediately, support poured in from dozens of neighbors who had seen her antics firsthand. Some shared their own stories of Karen's harassment, like Mr. Davis, who recalled her yelling at him about his unsightly garden gnome collection, or Linda from across the street, who had been accused of parking too loudly in her own driveway. However, Karen wasn't done. The next day, Mike received an official-looking letter from a local attorney. Karen was suing him for emotional distress, property damage, and public humiliation. She was demanding $50,000 in damages, claiming that the sewage incident had not only destroyed her property, but had also ruined her reputation, leading to psychological trauma. Mike's heart pounded as he read through the paperwork. The claim was absurd, but he knew Karen wouldn't stop at just threats. She had gone nuclear, and now she was dragging him through the court system. Desperate, Mike called a lawyer friend for advice, and they agreed to counter-sue for property damage, trespassing, and defamation of character. News of the lawsuit spread through the community, and opinions became divided. Some neighbors, still loyal to Karen despite the evidence, claimed Mike had gone too far, while others defended him, saying that Karen had pushed him to his limits. Tension in the neighborhood grew thick, and HOA remained conspicuously silent, clearly unsure of how to handle the civil war Karen had ignited. Then, just when Mike thought things couldn't get any worse, he discovered his tires had been slashed, every single one of them. He immediately checked the security footage and, unsurprisingly, saw Karen sneaking around his car just after midnight, a knife glinting in her hand. He reported the vandalism to the police, finally filing a formal complaint for destruction of property and harassment. The police took his statement and assured him they would investigate, but the damage was done. Mike's car was out of commission for days. Meanwhile, Karen strutted around the neighborhood like she had already won, spreading lies about how Mike was under investigation for domestic terrorism. It was clear she was trying to turn public opinion completely against him. Feeling cornered and exhausted, Mike knew it was time to hit back harder. He dug into public records, filing requests to access HOA meeting notes and previous complaints against Karen. What he found shocked him. Karen had a long history of filing false claims, harassing board members, and even threatening to sue the HOA itself when they didn't side with her on trivial matters. Mike compiled everything into a massive evidence folder, complete with a timeline of her toxic behavior. Determined to put an end to her reign of terror once and for all, Mike contacted several key board members and requested a formal mediation meeting. He knew Karen would never agree to it, but he wanted it on record that he had attempted to resolve things peacefully. The morning of the scheduled meeting, HOA members gathered at the community center, and Karen, predictably, refused to attend, claiming she felt unsafe being near Mike. But that didn't stop Mike from presenting his evidence. One by one, he showed the videos, the screenshots of harassment, the defamation posts, and even the police report about the slashed tires. By the end, most of the board members looked visibly shaken. One of them, clearly fed up with Karen's nonsense, admitted they had been receiving complaints about her for months, but were too intimidated to take action. Mike's presentation finally gave them the push they needed. After deliberation, the HOA issued an official statement condemning Karen's behavior and removing her from any potential leadership roles within the community. Additionally, they formally requested that she cease all communication with Mike and his property, warning that further harassment would result in legal consequences. Karen's lawsuit fell apart before it even reached court, especially after her own lawyer realized she had fabricated most of her claims. Meanwhile, Mike's countersuit for damages gained traction, and Karen found herself slapped with fines for vandalism and trespassing. Though Karen remained stubborn and resentful, it became clear to everyone that her influence had crumbled. Mike finally felt a weight lift from his shoulders as the neighborhood started to rally around him again. People stopped to chat, brought him homemade cookies, and offered to help repair his damaged garden. But deep down, Mike remained cautious. He knew Karen wasn't one to surrender completely. She might be licking her wounds now, but he sensed that somewhere in that twisted mind of hers, she was already plotting her next move. And so he kept his cameras on, his hose locked up tight, and his guard raised. Because when it came to Karen, you never knew when she would strike again. The weeks that followed were eerily quiet. Karen had retreated into her house, her curtains drawn like fortress walls. The once pristine garden was now neglected, weeds creeping up the edges of her driveway. The neighborhood, however, seemed to breathe easier without her constant meddling. People walked their dogs more freely, kids played on the street without being scolded for being too loud, and Mike's lawn remained blissfully undisturbed. Despite the silence, Mike didn't fully relax. He knew Karen too well by now. She was like a wounded animal, cornered and dangerous. So he kept his security system running, every camera active, just in case she tried to pull something new. But as the days turned into weeks, it seemed like the storm had finally passed. One evening, as Mike was grilling in his backyard, Glenn dropped by with a cooler of beers. They cracked open a couple of bottles and leaned against the fence, savoring the peace. "Think she's finally given up?" Glenn asked, nodding toward Karen's house. Mike took a long swig of his beer. "I hope so, but with Karen you never know. I half expect her to come charging over here with another fake lawsuit." Glenn chuckled. "She's practically a ghost now. Haven't seen her in days. Heard she's been complaining to the HOA about feeling unsafe because of the hostile environment you created." Mike rolled his eyes. "Of course, it's always someone else's fault with her." Just then, Mike's phone buzzed. It was a notification from the neighborhood forum. Curious, he opened it up and almost choked on his beer. Someone had posted a photo of Karen's driveway, piled high with moving boxes. A few minutes later, another neighbor posted a video of movers loading furniture into a truck. "Damn," Glenn said, peering over Mike's shoulder. "Looks like the Queen of Chaos is skipping town." Mike couldn't help but laugh, more out of relief than anything else. Guess she finally realized she couldn't bully the whole neighborhood into submission. Glenn clinked his bottle against Mike's. "Good riddance. Think we should throw a block party to celebrate?" The thought of an HOA-sanctioned farewell to Karen bash was tempting, but Mike just shook his head. "Nah, let's just enjoy the quiet while it lasts." Later that night, as Mike settled into bed, he couldn't help but feel an odd sense of finality. Had he really won? Or was this just another trick of hers to make him drop his guard? He couldn't quite shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done causing trouble yet. The next morning, he awoke to find a letter slid under his door. Immediately, his stomach dropped. Was this another lawsuit? A parting shot? Bracing himself, he unfolded the paper and read the hastily scrawled words. "You may have won this round, but I'm not done. This neighborhood isn't yours to control. I'll make sure you regret it someday. Karen." Mike scoffed, crumpling the note and tossing it into the trash. She really couldn't just let it go, could she? Despite the threat, Mike couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity. Karen had built her entire identity around controlling others, and now that she'd been publicly humiliated and exposed, she had nowhere to channel that energy. It was almost sad, in a twisted way. A few days later, the moving truck pulled out of the driveway for good. Mike watched from his window as Karen got into her car, sunglasses hiding her face, not daring to make eye contact with anyone. She sped off without so much as a backward glance. The neighborhood celebrated quietly but genuinely. Some folks baked cookies and delivered them to Mike, thanking him for standing up to the tyrant. A few even offered to help him with his garden as a show of solidarity. One morning, he found a handmade sign on his porch that read, "Neighborhood Hero. Thanks for standing up." He couldn't help but smile. Life returned to normal faster than Mike had expected. Without Karen's looming presence, people seemed happier, more relaxed. Glenn finally put up his colorful hammock again without fear of complaints. Kids played basketball in the cul-de-sac, and no one told them to keep it down. The air felt lighter, and for the first time in months, Mike felt like he truly belonged to the community. One Saturday morning, as Mike watered his freshly planted tomatoes with his newly purchased hose, he spotted a young couple walking down the street with a realtor. They stopped in front of Karen's now empty house, chatting animatedly about its potential. The woman looked over and gave Mike a friendly wave. He waved back, feeling cautiously optimistic. That evening, he baked a batch of cookies and brought them over, introducing himself as their soon-to-be neighbor. They were kind, down-to-earth, and genuinely excited to move in. They had a toddler and a golden retriever named Daisy, and they talked about how they were hoping to find a peaceful, welcoming place to settle down. Mike just grinned. "Well, you picked the right neighborhood," he assured them. "It's a great community here now." As weeks passed and the new family moved in, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, one that felt natural and warm. Occasionally, Mike would hear whispers about Karen's dramatic exit, but most people seemed content to move on and leave the chaos behind. But one evening, while checking his emails, Mike noticed a message from someone named Devin in another part of town. Curious, he opened it and burst out laughing. The message read, "You don't know me, but Karen just moved into our neighborhood. She's already complaining about barking dogs and leaves blowing into her yard. Saw your story online. Any advice on how to survive this nightmare?" Mike replied simply, "Good luck, buddy. Be prepared, and whatever you do, keep your hose under lock and key." As he closed his laptop, Mike felt a mix of satisfaction and empathy for Devin. It seemed Karen was determined to keep her streak of entitlement alive, no matter where she landed. But he knew one thing for sure. No matter how far Karen ran or how many neighborhoods she terrorized, people would always remember the day karma came through a garden hose. That night, as the sun dipped low and the air cooled, Mike sat on his porch, sipping a cold beer and watching the new family play with their dog. The world seemed right again. He knew he'd never forget the chaos Karen had brought to his life. But he also knew that sometimes the best victories came not from revenge but from resilience and knowing when to stand your ground. As he turned on his porch light and took one last look at his peaceful street, he couldn't help but smile. The battle was over. The neighborhood was safe again. And as far as Mike was concerned, no matter where Karen ended up next, he knew he'd left her with one unmistakable message. You mess with the wrong neighbor, and you might just end up covered in your own mess.